I'm with Shelaine Green in sunny Guernsey.
Not very sunny.
No, but we're good news today. You've been telling me about things which are actually happening here on the disability front.
Yeah, we've been talking about kind of the history of the development of the disability strategy in Guernsey. It's something that's going to the States probably in May next year. And it actually began probably 10 years ago when there was a Townsend report into poverty in Guernsey that identified that disabled people were likely to be at risk of poverty. That led to the States wanting to put together, on Townsend's recommendation, a group of people to become a disability forum to discuss these issues. That actually took a very, very, very long time to take off, at least another 5 years. But when it did, obviously the voluntary organisations involved with disabled people in the island needed to come together so they could have one representative who would be on that body to represent the voluntary sector. And a colleague of mine, a wonderful man called Rob Platt, who was the chair of the Guernsey MS Society at the time, took it upon himself, on some prompting from the States, to bring all the voluntary organisations together. We started off being called the Voluntary Organisations Group of the States Disability Forum. And when I got involved with a bit of a marketing background, I said, flippin' heck, we can't be called that, that's dreadful. And so we renamed ourselves the Guernsey Disability Alliance. And that also coincided with us realising that we hadn't just got together to be on this body. We actually had an awful lot in common as the 34 different disability charities involved. And there was a lot that we could talk about and do ourselves over and beyond just being a representative. So it was things like, even though we represented all sorts of different impairment groups, mental health, learning disability, autism, physical disability, we had in common things like the need for respite care, sorting out the benefit system, housing, community care, and particularly employment issues as well. That was common across the board. And so we started to work together more and more to be one voice that would be able to talk to the States. And as we developed, actually we found that more and more individual disabled people wanted to get involved as well, because there is no disabled people's group for individuals over here that's strongly talking to the States either. And so we're now a mixture of the disability charities and the individual disabled people. And this was 2008 when we formed, and at the end of that year, Rob did a presentation to what's called the Social Policy Group over here, which is a subset of Policy Council. And he was talking about disabled people's needs in Guernsey, and he asked for 3 things. Could we have one representative in the States, one of the deputies, who would be a champion for disabled people when anything relating to disabled people came up? He asked for, could there be one civil servant within the States that would be a central focal point for all things relating to disabled people? And he asked whether the States could actually have a disability strategy. Because at the time, we didn't know, and the States didn't know, how many disabled people there were in Guernsey, what their needs were, whether those needs were being met, and the needs that weren't being met, the States didn't know what order to take them in.
You're using the word disability, or is there a definition of disability, or is that
we use the UN definition of disability, and the first stage of developing the disability strategy was to do a research study where we asked, do you have a long-term condition that has a substantial effect on your life, lasting longer than 12 months? So it's basically a long-term health condition that affects your day-to-day life. So it isn't just about people who use wheelchairs or who happen to need a cane. It's also about, as I say, mental health, learning disability, autism, diabetes, any long-term illnesses even, respiratory disease, cancer. It's any long-term condition that affects your day-to-day life.
So I interrupt you. You've got your 3-point plan?
Yep, so we tried to get those 3 things sorted out. We've very definitely got the States champion. The first one was Deputy Jane Stevens, and she did a wonderful job, but she lost her seat at the last election in April. So we then went to a public election, did it very, very publicly, had hustings, we did all sorts of things. The manifestos were in the newspaper and on the radio, and by an overwhelming majority, the 600 people who registered to be part of the election voted for Deputy John Gollop.
But this was to vote for people who were already in the States?
Yes.
And they were to choose those as a disability champion?
Yes.
And
yes.
600 people took part?
600 people took part. It's a very, very public election. We did it with the Greffier. It was all officially done by postal ballots, and the Greffier counted the votes. We didn't know who'd won until he sent us the results. And it was very good for raising awareness of the fact that we needed to make progress for disabled.
And when was that? When was that election?
That was May this year. Actually, we ran through May, and then actually.
And Deputy Gollop's now in place.
Deputy Gollop's now in place. So we've got our disability champion. We've also got our disability and equalities officer. That's the civil servant who's looking holistically.
Salaried on a
Yes,
long-term contract.
on a 5-year. She was here just a 5-year post. And she's a lady called Emily Yerby, and she's absolutely fantastic.
What's her background?
She's actually one of the young rising stars in the States. And when she was at Cambridge, she was very involved in disability issues there, and now she's looking at it from a strategic states perspective. And she is, with the help of a disability steering group, which the Guernsey Disability Alliance is part of, along with some other third sector organisations in the States, departments, she's been drafting a disability strategy. And that's what will go to the States in May next year. And
Have you seen it, participated in it?
Well, we're part of the group that's putting it together. It's being done very much collaboratively. It's a big buzz phrase in Guernsey at the moment, third sector partnership between the States and the third sector. Third sector is just a posh term for the charities and the voluntary organisations.
Same in Jersey, are you not all suspicious about that?
What do you mean suspicious?
The gobbling up the charitable sector?
There is, you've got to be careful. There is almost talk of the third sector as being the saviours of the universe. And there's a lot we can achieve through partnership, yes, but what we aren't, we've got to be very clear about this, is a dumping ground for the state's problems when they don't particularly want to pay for sorting them out. No, we're not that. You can't just expect the voluntary sector to pick up what the state doesn't want to do. It's got to be a collaborative process where each side looks at the whole pathway for that particular.
Because you would have probably seen the Plymouth debate in Jersey, which just collapsed.
Yeah.
Only one vote, but it collapsed. But that was a third sector participation exercise. It wasn't about disability, but it was about
National Trust, wasn't
National Trust. But it's they've gone away to lick their wounds, made a lot of ill feeling. But those things have happened in other charitable activities. Silkworth Lodge had great problems getting funding, and the funding was stopped, and all being tied up with service level agreements and loans. Worrying to my perception.
It can be difficult, but it can also work. We've got other examples where it really, really works. My background is with brain injury. I started Headway Guernsey about 6-7 years ago. You've got a big Headway in Jersey run by Andrew Green. Andrew helped in the process of starting up Headway Guernsey. And that organisation works very much in partnership with the clinical neuropsychologist within HSSD to make sure that there's an actual smooth pathway for people with brain injury, some of which is provided in the voluntary sector, some of which is provided from the state.
So your strategy, which you find satisfactory, is going to the States in May?
May, yes.
And does that include the magic words international obligations?
It includes reference to the UN Convention for People with Disabilities, yes it does. It includes reference to disability discrimination law, disability equality law. It includes all those big things as well.
And
now,
are they
I say it's
lined
going
up?
to the States, I don't say they're going to vote for it.
No.
But we are so far behind on those things, it's not true. I mean, 95% of the world's population is now covered by signing up to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So
Well, you can be assured you're far ahead of Jersey on this regard, so if that's any consolation to you.
I'm not sure we are, in that I think you're further ahead actually developing disability discrimination law, because I know there was a proposition put to the States a few years ago that they should have equality law by the end of 2012. Now, they didn't achieve
They
that.
also voted for sustainable transport, but I'm afraid that's a million years away, so.
But we haven't even got that commitment to a deadline that hasn't been hit. You've got a commitment to a deadline that hasn't been hit. We haven't even got a deadline.
The bottom line is the bottom line, and St Peter Port is a wonderfully pretty town, but it is so inaccessible for people with disabilities.
It is, and I think what we need to make clear is in our meetings, our own members are very clear. They do not want to bulldoze town. They do not want to tarmac the high street. They love St Peter Port, but it could be that little bit easier. For example, there's a ramp at the town church now, which is fantastic, and the constables have put that in. But because it's a separate department, it's traffic that decide where the drop curbs are. You go up the ramp, and then you're stuck, not being able to get down into the high street. So
You've already got the same bus company that Jersey's about to have from January the 1st. Are they an accessible bus company?
The buses have always been very accessible, but you have to define access, because there's access in terms of being able to get on the bus, but I'm not sure anybody's thought about how you get to the bus stop, and whether, say, a wheelchair user, for example, is going to be in a very vulnerable position on some bus stop at the side of the road and is going to get completely soaking wet and not be able to recover their body temperature very easily. I don't think they've actually thought about accessible transport from A to B. They've thought about that middle section and making sure people can get on the buses, but have they thought about whether disabled people can get to the buses in the first place and can get to where they want to go from there?
Well, good designing to enable, that's an essential part of the process.
It is.
Nothing happens without good design. How about buildings? What's happening to them?
Well, the one piece of legislation that affects disabled people we do have in Guernsey is Part M of the building regulations. So any building that's been built from scratch, or it's a very significant refurbishment, has to meet certain access criteria. And that is changing things slowly, but of course it doesn't, it's not a retro thing. If you have an old building and you want to make it accessible, that's at the will of the people who own the building.
And if you put a new building in a cobbled street, you've still got some pretty severe...
Exactly, yes. Again, it's not just about whether... I have a wonderful example of a company that put in a beautiful lift to take people to the top floor, but there was shingle between the road and the lift. So they'd spent all that money on the lift, and a wheelchair user could never have got to it.
And we were admiring your very picturesque ice skating facility at the moment, the ramped access, but we were left wondering what happens when you get to the top of the ramp if you've got disabilities. What does happen?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't been up there. I haven't been up there to have a look. I'm not sure, and none of the members have talked to me about it. I think they've probably just observed it. More important to us, actually, is just alongside that ice rink there is a ramp that goes up those steps, and that was probably the inspiration for the Guernsey Disability Alliance. That was Dave Purdy.
We're going to talk to Deputy Gollop in the fullness about this issue and other aspects of government, but in practical terms, you've got an officer who's on a contract for several years, 5 years I think you said.
Yep.
What's the plan now? The strategy's gone. If that fails, what will the officer do?
If that fails, what will the officer do? Oh my gosh, and what will we do? That's another question entirely. The one thing that gives me great comfort, actually, if it were to fail, and I don't think it will, because we did an awful lot of work at the election, talking to the candidates, making sure they were pro this, but will it be passed in its entirety, or would it be passed in a kind of diluted form? That's probably more likely. One thing that's happening an awful lot at the moment, and I don't know if it's happening in Jersey as well, is a lot of the departments are going through really big reviews. So there's a benefits and tax review here, there's the HSSD 2020 vision here, education's due for publishing its new vision, etc. One thing we will do is make sure that when those reviews happen for everybody, disabled people are at the table. So that even if we don't have our own individual strategy, we are included and represented in everything the state does going forward. And one thing is absolutely for sure, we're not going away.
You had 600 people turn out for your vote. Do you think that's a large number of those can be mobilised on disability issues?
Mobilising all of them in a radical way, absolutely not. One of the things you have to balance in the islands is that you're in a very, very, what might be called a high Tory environment, with a group of people who are not in a million years going to chain themselves to any railings or anything like this. This is going to be a long-term negotiation process. But Mike Torrode, who was Chief Minister a few Chief Ministers ago, his last exercise as Chief Minister was to come and meet the GDA. And he said, fundamentally said, it's not that we have anything against disabled people at all. We just don't hear from you, and we don't know what you need. So whatever happens, strategy, no strategy, whatever happens, they are now hearing from disabled people.
Okay, we're most grateful for your time.
Okay.